Hello, hi. My name is Kevin Gregsch. I'm a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for Sociolegal Studies at the University of Oxford. The purpose of this video is to give you an introduction into my British Academy Postdoctoral Fellowship project, which is entitled Out of Sight, Out of Regulation, Ensuring Sustainable Underground Governance in the UK. So this is meant to be like a lightweight, simple introduction into the topic. What is it about? Why am I interested in the underground? What are like some key questions, but also themes that have already emerged in here. So I'm going to take you through a couple of slides, like opening up the problem, giving you an example from the UK, what are some problems, etc., etc. So just that you have me on a slightly bigger scale. As I said, my name is Kevin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Sociolegal Studies at the University of Oxford. If you're seeing, or if you're watching this video, you are on my website, so I don't need to provide my email address here. You find my contact details and on my staff website at the University of Oxford, or just Google the name. So why am I interested in underground? Well, first of all, I think it's one of these forgotten spaces, and one of those spaces we kind of take for granted, because actually using the underground, or we as humans using the underground, is nothing new. We've been using the underground for thousands of years to extract mineral resources or other natural resources like groundwater. If you are a fan of the recent adaptation of the novels Poldark, which are set in Cornwall, that's all about mining, tin mining, which made Cornwall rich in previous centuries. So what you see here on the slide are just some examples regarding underground use. And let me start with maybe, which is very obvious, which is on the left-hand side, and then I'm going clockwise. So top left-hand side, we see some lignite mining. This is from the east of Germany, where this is still heavily going on. Well, you could argue this is at the boundary between surface and underground, but at the same time you are digging up the underground, although it's usually roughly plus minus 60 meters. But it is of course to access a fossil fuel resource in the underground. Then you see an oil rig in the North Sea extracting oil. Others are extracting gas from the rich oil and gas fields in the North Sea bed. Then on the right-hand side, we see an example of a typical, and we find this in many Western countries, of course the UK, where it has driven industrialization, but you find it in France, in Spain, in Belgium, in Germany, in Poland, in Ukraine, you name it, Australia, etc. And that's deep mining, often for coal, but also other mineral resources, or iron ore, salt as well, and you name it. But then, of course, we also use the underground for transport. And of course, this being an example of the London Tube, we find metros, U-Bahns, subways, all over the world. And we're moving in the underground. We have tunnels for cars, railway, etc. So, or we have tunnels for foot passengers to cross large streets, etc., etc. Shopping centers are underground. So we use the underground actually on a daily basis. Often we just take it for granted, I suppose. And then finishing off on the left-hand side bottom, this is a test site in Germany for storing nuclear waste. And this is more, I chose this to finish this slide with this because obviously this is an issue which will take more importance in the future, because Western countries, especially in Europe, started using nuclear energy in the 50s and 60s, and now these nuclear power plants are coming to the end of their lifetime. So there's this like big wave of nuclear waste rolling towards us, and we need to get basically get rid of it. And without getting too much into like the nitty-gritty parts of it, you have like different levels of radiation, and this one is one, of course, for like medium and high level radioactive waste, and it needs to be stored down there for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, or forever, whatever that means. So these sites need to be tested, they need to be safe, and they are very controversial. And there are, especially in this case in Germany, like protests or ongoing protests. Okay, so it's nothing new, but of course, what sparked my interest is that kind of like a re-emergence of the underground as a space that gets more and more used. And one of my hypotheses is that we use more underground space again because space above the ground surface has become scarce and it's expensive. But let me go again through these examples. So on the left-hand side, you see a fracking site, and I will go into this into a little bit more detail, exemplifying this in the UK later on in this presentation. But it's certainly like what a very controversial technology, but it's something new in the sense that it pops all over in the US. Here in Europe, some countries have put a ban on fracking. In the UK, the current situation is that it's not really a ban, but there's like a moratorium on fracking at the moment. But as I said, I'll talk about this later again. What we see in the middle is an example of a so-called like pyramid house. Pyramid because we can only see the top. These types of houses have sprung up especially in London. And the reason is that often very affluent homeowners who own what I would say already large properties, who are often listed, so you can't like add another like story on them. You can't do any like additional building work on the existing building. But apparently there seems to be a need to have more space. So what do these homeowners do? They go underground. And this is the reason, and I'm to apologize, it's not pyramid house, it's iceberg houses. No? So I correct myself here, iceberg house, because you can only see the tip. So what we find underneath the surface is everything from like garages for cars to swimming pools to tennis courts, squash courts, party rooms, you name it. Whatever is up to our imagination, it's possible. But of course it has like some interesting implications for property rights, because obviously you're going under other people's properties, or you could go, depending on how large your area of land is. And then on the right-hand side, another technology which is discussed, and again, maybe as controversial as fracking, and it's carbon capture and storage, so that we take CO2, so carbon dioxide, away from the atmosphere. We basically pump it into the ground and store it there securely, thereby mitigating climate change. Okay, so maybe a little like summary at this point. Underground space, or the use of underground space, could solve like space problems in cities. If you think of like putting infrastructure underground, thereby freeing up space above ground. For example, in Helsinki, so the capital of Finland, we find like a whole water treatment works underground. bin collection, like with, and so on, could all go underground. We could have like things like, for example, like multi-use like tunnels. And I think there's an example, I think it's in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, where a tunnel is used like for transport, so cars, so it's part of the road network, but after like a storm, heavy storm, heavy rain, it will be closed for like normal traffic, and it can be used as a retention area, like for excess water. Some also say it's underground space is the final urban frontier, because as I said at the beginning, there is an increasing interest precisely because land above ground is scarce and expensive. So we're trying to find new ways. And then, of course, this opens up like interesting like legal perspectives. So land ownership is key. So property rights, liabilities in case something happens. And what we find in many countries is actually regulations for the depth of the underground or the space, underground space that belongs to like a property holder, and that varies greatly depending on the jurisdiction. Sometimes we find that states make compulsory purchases of underground space. And we also see increasingly that it is part of the planning process. So for example, and I mentioned Helsinki in Finland before, there's an underground master plan, and the Netherlands have integrated underground space planning into their like national spatial planning plan. So in my research, I'm starting with the assumption that geological underground models deliver only frameworks for possible uses, but we do not know much about the interactions between geological characteristics and the human uses, demands, and changes. What am I trying to say with this is that our like discussion about the underground is very much dominated by like technological aspects instead of like legal aspects and societal aspects. So what effect does it have on societies when we use more underground space, positive and negative? So these are the types of like questions that interest me. From that follows that the governance of underground space can be complicated as it involves conflicting uses and legal regulations. And we will see that later in the UK example, precisely because we have these like different like uses of the underground, which like led to like different responsibilities, like different governmental departments, agencies, etc., being responsible for parts of the underground space. And then underground has become an economic and political arena with potential consequences, for example, for safe drinking water supply. So here comes in my other expertise, which is on water governance, and I've worked on water governance many, many years. And my working hypothesis is that if we use underground more and more, we need to make sure that this does not have like an adverse effect on our like, drinking water supply, where drinking water comes from underground resources, so from aquifers. Hence, one of my goals is to like develop like an improved and sustainable governance of underground space in the UK. So how can we assure this? So let's take a closer look at the United Kingdom. So coal, gas, minerals, silver and gold belong to the Crown. It's as simple as that. But in order to extract these different types, so these fossil fuels or minerals, it's basically outsourced, or the rights are outsourced to agencies who then give out licenses to companies who can then, whatever, open a mine to dig for coal. Bring in water. Groundwater is owned by the landowner, yet its use is limited to reasonable use or governed by abstraction licenses. So, for example, like a water company in the in England has an abstraction license, or usually they have many because they don't usually have just one source where they draw water from. And that abstraction license like stipulates exactly how many megaliters per day or per year they can abstract from that source. So it's regulated. Now, since England is a common law country, we still find that slightly odd rule, which translates into whoever owns the soil, it is theirs all the way to heaven and all the way to the depth below. That sounds slightly odd and impractical. If you think of like the second part, so all the way to the depth below, to the center of the earth, like from a physical point, obviously that doesn't make any sense, because the deeper you go, the more weight would be on you. You would be just simply crushed by the weight of the earth. But the interesting thing about this is that this has been qualified for airspace above a property, because otherwise, anytime an aeroplane would fly over your property, they would need to ask your permission. So it has well been qualified for airspace above a property, but below a property, so for the underground space, it's a bit more of a patchwork of like rules and regulations. Although, and I stressed this already here, there have been changes to the Infrastructure Act in 2015, limiting it. Why? I'll come back to that in a minute. So what we find, and I'm staying here in the UK, is like a fragmented, like planning under the responsibility of local authorities. So there's no national like planning plan or program in the UK. It's all very fragmented and under the responsibility of like local authorities, so cities and counties. At the same time, there's a little caveat that nationally significant infrastructure projects, such as power stations or large renewable energy projects or airports, for example, fall under the authority of central government. Now, this is a little bit like open to interpretation. What's a significant infrastructure project? And we will see that argument coming back when I talk about like fracking in the UK. And I should mention that strategic regional planning was abolished again in 2011. So what you see in the table is like just a tiny little like bit of like differentiation of the different departments and agencies who are responsible like for like different like resources. So for water supply, we find like the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, then the environment agencies for the like, constituent parts of the UK, so England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But then at the same time, fossil fuels and mineral resources are under the auspices of the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. But the national planning framework is under the responsibility of the Department for Communities and Local Government. From a governance perspective, this doesn't necessarily have to mean that this is somehow like messy or so, no, because there can be some form of like arrangements and collaboration, but it's just to showcase how differentiated the different like responsibilities are, like opening up the problem. As I said, I will find out later whether this actually causes any problems or not, because as I said at the very beginning, this is like opening up the topic. So let's spend a few minutes on the example of fracking in England, because not only in England, it's very controversial. And as I said at the beginning, some countries have put a ban on fracking. Others are very keen on it, like the United States, seeing it as a way of becoming like more independent from like oil or gas imports from other countries. So what's happening in terms of fracking in England is that there are 4 active test sites in Lancashire, Nottinghamshire, Surrey, and Yorkshire. At the moment, there's no fracking going on. There's kind of like a moratorium because there have been earthquakes at test sites. And what is also quite significant and should be mentioned in the context of like fracking in England is that there are huge like local protests against it. And that has some interesting like implications. So if you remember what I said just a minute ago about like the government like having oversight, or central government having oversight over like nationally significant infrastructure projects. So we find exactly like a variation of this with fracking. So for example, the government in London was very keen on fracking as part of its like energy strategy. Not so the local councils, because they were fearing like environmental degradation, protests, etc., etc. So, for example, in 2015, so 5 years ago, the UK government said, if local councils do not act and fail to take decisions on like give out permissions to fracking sites, the government will step in. So the government can use like this instrument of like declaring it like a nationally significant infrastructure, and then actually step in. I mentioned the earthquakes, so just to be clear, tests must be stopped if tremors are above 0.5 on the Richter scale, and that has happened a few times, and is one of the reasons why it has been stopped now. So in order to boost its like fracking, the government announced Natasha Engel as kind of like a shale gas tsar, as The Guardian has titled it here. And she was quoted saying that because she struggled with how little advancement there was with fracking in the UK, and she said that she could not understand why politicians would listen to a teenager who tells children not to go to school. So that was her opinion on how the government deals with fracking and its protesters. And then we have another like interesting like legal instrument working here, the so-called like preemptive injunction. So it's an injunction anticipating the breach of a legal right. Interesting enough, this was introduced for one of the Harry Potter books, for the publication of one of the Harry Potter books. So this preemptive injunction allows for like that restrictions can be placed on unnamed individuals in anticipation of illegal actions. And all fracking companies were granted such an injunction. So they were expecting these protests. So they all applied for these preemptive injunctions, and they were all granted. Of course, they were challenged in court, but they were renewed. And if you break that preemptive injunction, you would face up to 2 years in prison and up to like £5,000 in fines. So let's go a little bit like deeper here and see what is interesting about the fracking case. So I mentioned this briefly before. The Infrastructure Act 2015 simplifies the procedure for obtaining the right to underground land 300 meters and below for the purpose of exploiting oil and gas, petroleum, and deep geothermal energy. So that common law rule that everything under your property to the center of the earth belongs to you has been qualified actually here to 300 meters, making it more easy for companies to access. And for fracking, this is interesting because fracking is not, if you imagine this is the surface, fracking is not just going like down vertically, but it goes down vertically, and then it goes this direction. No? So you go in and this, no? So it affects like many properties. No? Then, and I mentioned this before, no, government could classify fracking sites as nationally significant infrastructure problems, no, i.e. approval would come at national and not at local level. This has happened times and again before in the UK with reservoir lakes, for example, in Wales. And usually it caused a huge outcry, especially among the local people. To give a concrete example, in 2016, central government, by accepting an appeal from the fracking company Quadrilla, overturned Lancashire Council's rejection of a fracking site. So it actually did step in. I came across an interesting paper by Alan Stokes from the University of Birmingham, who makes a case for like or discussing like fracking in the United Kingdom, and she makes this interesting distinction between like regulatory domain versus regulatory dexterity. So what does that mean? So regulatory domain means that fracking is basically the same as other drilling technologies. So we don't actually need any new like regulations. No? So the argument is made that no, it's just the same as like drilling down for any other like resources or fossil fuels. On the other hand, regulatory dexterity describes, and in the case for fracking, that, for example, finance, planning permissions, and land access are kind of like singled out. And it is argued, no, this is not as with like previous like technologies. So for these parts, we need new regulations. So it has this interesting like notion that fracking regulation is at the same time like fixed, but also flexible. It just depends on what aspect you look at. So the government basically set the narrative that like fracking is not new, but kind of like it's the old and inflexible like planning permission system that needs to be changed, as well as the access to land, which was also seen as very impractical. So what was the result? Well, the result was that there was a new tax regime for fracking that deals with the like financing of like fracking, because obviously it's a very expensive adventure. Then new planning process, especially the issue of notification. Then, and I mentioned this in the previous slide, the changes to the Infrastructure Act, so the 300 meter rule. And also what we find is like little public debate, and instead like showering money over these communities where the test like fracking sites are. And a large like part of that money is coming from the companies, actually. Okay, let's summarize this a bit. So I think it's fair to say that there is an increasing interest in underground space. There is definitely an interest in the context also of like property rights, and I discussed this with a co-author in a paper 3 years ago, that property rights should not just be seen as like a legal or economic relationship, but also as a social relationship. People have an attachment to property, even like public spaces. We've also seen, for example, that the UK is currently looking for, to give you another example for the increasing interest in underground space. So the UK is currently looking, and I should say again, for a site where to store safely its nuclear waste. And they kind of like opened up the process with a video made in Northern Ireland, and that caused like a huge like PR disaster, because of course Northern Ireland is always like a very sensitive issue, and people were not very happy with this. So I think I could show that there is a plethora of rules, regulation, and responsibilities, and one could say that this could lead to like unsustainable governance of the underground with potential effects on drinking water supply. But this is like a working like hypothesis, and I'm going into this like deeper as I go along in my research. A few themes. So planning regulations are an interesting theme. So there's like nationally, like local planning versus like nationally significant infrastructure. It's definitely, and I could show this for the example of fracking, a political matter. We've seen huge local protests. People just don't want, or they have the feeling that like non-local like companies are intruding kind of like their land. No? This also speaks to that like sense of ownership. No? This is our land. No? And then like this neglect of like wider effects. So there's no like public discourse, no public debate on what the effect of like the use of more underground space for whatever it is has on the environment and on our humans. Okay, so this is the end here of this like introductory presentation to my British Academy Fellowship project. If you're interested, please do get in touch with me. I'm happy to answer your questions, and I thank you.